Many of history's greatest armoured fighting vehicles emerged during the Second World War. These vehicles have not only come to symbolise the struggle of their respected armies in that titanic clash, but furthermore have transcended the battlefield to become ongoing symbols of their nation's grit and determination in the face of the enemy. But while we may admire the classic lines of the M4 Sherman or the revolutionary shape of the armour of the T-34, in terms of instilling fear in its enemy, one tank stands head and shoulders above the rest: the German Tiger tank. Despite a somewhat inauspicious start, when the heavyweight Tiger made its presence known on the battlefield, it sent shockwaves amongst the Allies, who quickly began to fear the prospect of facing off against waves of nothing but these powerful and resilient tanks, which for a time appeared almost unstoppable. In this episode, we are going to examine the origins of this tank, explore its impact on the war, assess its drawbacks, and look at its legacy in the annals of military history. Welcome to Wars of the World. Tank warfare burst onto the scene during the bitter and bloody slog of the Great War. Such was the lethality of the modern battlefield that men were being cut down in their thousands, spurring on the development of vehicles that offered as much protection as possible to their occupants, in order to storm enemy positions with any degree of success. Such was their effectiveness that in the Treaty of Versailles, which outlined terms for armistice, Germany was forbidden from possessing any tanks. When Adolf Hitler rose to power in 1933, he promised to cast off the shackles of the Treaty of Versailles and ordered work to begin on new German tanks. Initially disguised as tractors or security vehicles, these early tanks were both lightly armoured and lightly armed, but they gave German engineers valuable experience in designing tracked vehicles. When there was no longer any need to hide the fact that Germany was building tanks, these vehicles were designated as Panzerkampfwagens, which translates into English as armoured fighting vehicles, although they were more commonly known as panzers. The early light tanks were retroactively named Panzer I and II, and were generally only good for scouting and policing duties. These were followed up by the much more credible Panzer IIIs and IVs, both of whom enjoyed very long lives thanks to their ability to continuously improve throughout the war. However, it was superior tactics that won the day against Polish, and then later British and French tank forces. In the latter case, the French army had arguably the best tanks in the world in 1940, but they were poorly utilised. But the real test of Germany's tank forces would come a year later. On Sunday, 22nd of June 1941, Hitler undertook Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. This was the largest land invasion in history, comprising 3.8 million German and Axis troops, including over 3,500 tanks. Despite its numerical and geographical advantages, Stalin's Soviet Union was ill-prepared to meet the fascist threat in the summer of 1941, and was often overwhelmed. However, Stalin had by that time already instigated programs for new, more advanced tanks for the Red Army. The KV-1 was a heavy tank in the 45-ton range that enjoyed heavy frontal armour that required the Germans to either get in dangerously close to the tank, where their guns had the power to penetrate it, or they had to outflank it, attacking from its weaker sides and rear. The Germans met the KV-1 early on in the invasion, but again, superior tactics won the day. However, probably the biggest shock to the Germans, who were expecting to face a wholly inferior army, came in the shape of a medium tank dubbed the T-34. While not as armoured as the KV-1, its protection made use of sloped sides, which greatly increased the depth that enemy shells would have to penetrate, and often resulted in ricochets. Equipped with a gun potent for the time, the 76mm main gun, even in the hands of poorly trained Soviet conscripts, the T-34 was a dangerous weapon to a panzer, and thus respected by Axis leaders. But in the hands of ace commanders like Dmitry Lavrenenko, the T-34 could be unstoppable. While the Axis forces generally still enjoyed success on the battlefield through the waning days of 1941, they knew that Stalin was now organized and engaged, and that these tanks and their crews would only get better. The German High Command realized they needed an answer to these tanks, but rather than simply match these new Soviet weapons, they needed to better them, for they were likely to face higher numbers of these vehicles in the future as they continued their advance eastward after the winter of 1941-42. It was also recognized that in the West, the British and their Commonwealth allies had also learned from their earlier mistakes and were enjoying supplies of more advanced American tanks. The Germans realized that what they needed was a new heavy breakthrough tank that could take on superior numbers of Allied medium tanks with confidence and present a credible threat to the KV-1 and its successors. In an effort to speed up development, it was stipulated to German engineers that they should try to use proven design philosophies and even components from earlier tanks where possible, just on a larger scale. Two companies came into competition with each other to produce the tank, Henschel and Porsche. Henschel had actually begun work on a heavy tank design as early as 1937, although this never went beyond the experimental stage. The two tank prototypes weighed in at nearly double that of a Panzer IV, being in the 54-ton range when fitted with a turret designed by Krupp, and which sported the superb 88mm KWK-36 gun. This gun was a development of the Flak 36 anti-aircraft gun, but in the deserts of North Africa, it was found to have excellent anti-armor performance when angled downwards at enemy tanks. Both vehicles were required to be ready for testing by Hitler's 56th birthday on April 20th, 1942, the Henschel team only barely getting their vehicle onto the train in time for it to be moved to the testing ground at Rastenburg in modern-day Poland, where the Führer was waiting to inspect them. Porsche was confident of success, and had even begun work on the first 100 vehicles when the Henschel design was selected in preference. The judges of the trials were concerned about Porsche's choice of a petrol-electric transmission system that required large amounts of copper, which, due to wartime pressures, was already in short supply. 91 of Porsche's hulls would be completed, however, as the Elefant heavy tank destroyer, a superb fighting vehicle in its own right, which would achieve an impressive record on the battlefield, despite being built in such small numbers. Despite being chosen as the preferred tank, Henschel's design was far from perfect, and suffered numerous breakdowns which delayed service entry by several months, as the design was refined and production facilities set up by Henschel and its suppliers to meet the demands of this armoured Goliath. But by September 1942, Hitler was eager to unleash its first new tanks, named the Tiger, onto its enemies. At first glance, the Tiger I gives little indication as to its potency. In overall shape, it resembled the earlier Panzer IV, just significantly scaled up, having flat or shallow angled sides as opposed to the revolutionary sloping armour of the T-34 with all its advantages. However, this traditional design philosophy hid the protection afforded to the new tank with an extremely tough to penetrate 100mm on the front, around 10mm more than that found on the KV-1. Side armour was in the region of 60mm, while the belly and roof were 25mm thick. Its boxy design afforded ample internal space and made assembly easier. However, Henschel lacked the facilities for forming or welding the heavy armoured panels, requiring them to be transported to other factories for assembly. This was a growing concern in late 1942, as American, British and Canadian bombers were by this time beginning to cause ever greater disruption to the German manufacturing and transportation network. Despite its size, the Tiger was no slouch, thanks to a 690 horsepower Maybach HL230 P45 V12 engine. On the road, this had the capacity to propel the 45-ton tank along tarmac at a bustling 28.2 miles per hour, this being reduced to a more conservative 13 miles per hour across country. This actually gave it performance in the same class as the preceding Panzer IV. Although with a top speed of 33 miles an hour, the T-34 was a difficult opponent to catch. In service, the Tiger was crewed by 5 men. In the turret sat the commander, the gunner and the loader for the main gun. As many as 92 rounds of ammunition for the 82mm gun could be stored in the vehicle, and comprised of armor-piercing shells for taking out enemy tanks, or high-explosive shells for destroying buildings and fortified positions. In the hull sat the driver seated on the left, while to his right was a radio operator who also operated a 7.92mm MG-34 machine gun. The main training center for prospective Tiger crews was at the barracks of Panzer Regiment 11 at Paderborn and Zena, with a tank gunnery school on the coast at Putlos. Initially, Tiger crews were hand-picked for their proficiency in battle in Panzer IIIs and IVs, or because they had excelled in training. In September of 1942, the first production vehicles began to reach the front, with the 502nd Heavy Panzer Battalion, who at the time were in action around the besieged city of Leningrad. Given the reverence bestowed upon the tank by history, its first engagement was less than auspicious. The terrain was soft and boggy, causing the heavy tanks to sink and become stuck, whereupon they were repeatedly hit by Soviet anti-tank fire. They also continued to suffer from transmission problems, as the tanks tried to traverse such difficult terrain. These factors forced the 502nd to restrict their new Tigers to roads until winter set in and the ground hardened. Yet despite these problems, the Tiger was already showing that it was a tough nut to crack. For example, the 76mm guns of the T-34 struggled to even make an impact on the weaker sides of the Tiger, to say nothing of the front. While the Tiger's own 88mm gun was too much even for the heavier KV-1. The Western Allies wouldn't have too long to wait before they too felt the jaws of this new Tiger clamping down on them. Their first engagement with the new tank took place on December 1st, 1942 in Tunisia as part of the North African campaign. 3 Tigers attacked Allied tanks in an olive grove 5 kilometers west of Judaidah, the vegetation providing enough cover for both sides to get in close before engaging, where the Tigers destroyed 2 M3 Lee tanks, despite taking heavy fire themselves at close range with only minimal effect. 9 days later, on December 10th, a formation of US light tanks comprising of M3 and M5 Stuarts attacked German artillery positions near Majez el Bab, prompting the deployment of 5 Tigers to counter them. The Tigers obliterated the light tanks, counting for at least 20 of their number without loss, the light weapons of the Stuarts proving completely ineffective against the Tigers. On both the Eastern Front and in North Africa, the Tiger was soon growing in strength, and as many as 100 a month were being built during the first half of 1943, although even this was below what was needed by the Wehrmacht, given the thousands of tanks the Allies were now churning out. However, the variants of the Churchill, Sherman, and T-34 then in service all proved woefully inferior to the Tiger, resulting in Allied leaders actually altering their plans to either counter known Tiger units or even bypass them altogether. Where possible, aircraft and artillery were sent in to destroy them beforehand, but with just one Tiger being able to take on multiple Shermans with confidence, trepidation grew amongst Allied tank crews as they began to suffer from what became known as the Tiger phobia, or Tiger terror. Something had to be done. The Tiger offered great promise on the battlefield, and from the Allies' point of view, it promised to dominate the battlefield if it appeared in any significant numbers. This was reinforced when the British were able to examine an abandoned Tiger tank following an encounter on April 21, 1943. Members of the British 43rd Royal Tank Regiment engaged 2 Tigers at Guerrier al-Attah, Tunisia. This tank was recovered, examined intensely, and is today on display at the Tank Museum at Bovington in the UK. While the Allies quickly learned to respect, or perhaps even fear, the Tiger tank, they knew that it was not indestructible. They knew that it was only a false perception that the Tiger was indestructible, and they initiated crash programs to even up the playing field. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet Union instigated an improvement program for the T-34, replacing the 76mm gun with an 85mm. This gave the T-34 considerably greater penetrative power, but not being designed for such a weapon meant that the crews had to be careful not to damage the barrel when traversing inclines. Dubbed the T-34-85, over 22,000 examples would be built and presented a genuine threat to the Tiger. The Soviets were also eager to develop their own heavy tanks to meet the Tiger head-on. The KV-1 was improved upon, but later it was joined by the first in a new series of heavy tanks that were adorned with the name of the Soviet leader himself. The IS-2 heavy tank weighed in at 46 tons, but supported exceptional armour and a powerful 100mm gun, although this came at the cost of inferior mobility. The Germans would themselves be impressed with the IS-2, leading German General Hasso von Manteuffel to remark that they were the finest tanks in the world. The Western Allies were not as interested in heavy tanks, preferring to build large numbers of good medium tanks to overwhelm an enemy. A notable exception being the M26 Pershing. In response to the appearance of the Tiger, the M4 Sherman's standard 75mm gun was replaced by a higher velocity 76mm weapon. This made the Sherman even deadlier to the older Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks, and Allied intelligence believed that it would have sufficient power to penetrate a Tiger's armour at normal combat ranges. However, this assessment was based on tests conducted under ideal and somewhat sterile conditions. On the battlefield, it was discovered that the new Sherman still had to get in dangerously close to have an impact, and even then, only from the sides or the rear where the Tiger's armour was weakest, and then they still had to survive the Tiger's deadly 88mm gun to do so. The British went a step further and developed a variant of the Sherman armed with the Ordnance quick-firing 17-pounder, high-velocity anti-tank gun. This too was a 76.2mm weapon, but was one of the most powerful guns of its class anywhere in the world at the time, even demonstrating greater penetrative power than the Tiger's own 88mm gun. A downside of this gun was that it produced a bright muzzle flash, which not only meant that the crew had to blink when firing to prevent temporary blindness, but it also helped Axis troops to locate them once the battle had commenced, and this feature led to it being bestowed the name the Firefly. Recognizing the threat the Firefly presented, German Tiger crews often prioritized destroying these long-barreled Shermans. By the time of the Normandy invasion in June 1944, the potency the Tiger had enjoyed was beginning to wane, especially with the dominance of Allied air power. Aircraft such as the British Hawker Typhoon and the Soviet Il-2 Sturmovik packed a considerable punch with bombs and air-to-ground rockets, and were almost impossible for the Tiger crews to fend off. Almost. During its retreat from the Leningrad front, a Tiger from the 502nd, the very same units that had given the Tiger its baptism of fire, trained its 88mm gun on a group of attacking Il-2 Sturmoviks that were coming in low, and scored a direct hit, devastating one of the aircraft. This was just one of a number of remarkable exploits that the Tiger achieved during its career. Demonstrating the protection afforded to the Tiger was Tiger 231, serving with the 503rd Heavy Panzer Battalion. During a series of actions near the town of Semyernikovo in early 1943, the Tiger sustained no less than 252 hits from various Soviet anti-tank weaponry up to 45mm in size, and despite significant damage to its suspension, was still able to drive back to its staging ground under its own power. But probably the most notable Tiger action occurred during the German counteroffensive against the Normandy beachhead. On June 13, 1944, the British 7th Armoured Division entered the town of Villers-Bocage, looking to exploit a gap in the German lines. Instead, they ran into a Tiger, commanded by Michael Wittmann. Emerging from cover in the rear of the British formation, he was reported to have engaged and destroyed up to 14 tanks, 2 anti-tank guns, and up to 15 unarmoured trucks and supporting vehicles in just under 15 minutes. Many historians, however, now believe that these figures were part of a Nazi propaganda effort to make a hero out of Wittmann, and that some of the destroyed vehicles were taken out by other tanks of Wittmann's unit. But even still, the vast majority were still attributed to being destroyed by Wittmann. Regardless, the incident still demonstrates the potency of the Tiger in combat. The impact which the Tiger had on the Allies, and the fear that surrounded the tank, did in the post-war period and beyond conceal the fact that despite its lethality when operating under ideal conditions, the Tiger was actually a rather flawed tank, both in its design and its operation. Firstly, and probably most significantly, the Tiger was a complex vehicle to build and operate without careful maintenance. It was prone to breaking down, something that happened often in the mud, dirt, shot and shell of war. Despite its sprightly top performance of a tank for its size, Driving at speed put enormous pressure on the inner workings of the vehicle, which led to crews being put under speed restrictions when out of combat, to prevent the gears and shafts from being worn out prematurely. Its overlapping wheel and torsion bar suspension arrangement was notoriously difficult to both clean and fix in the field. Despite its reputation, the Tiger was not invulnerable, and producing replacements proved a major headache for the Germans. The Tiger was significantly more expensive to manufacture than the earlier Panzers or tank destroyers, and consumed vastly more resources in terms of both manufacturing materials and the supporting logistics chain. Tiger tank production peaked at 104 vehicles a month. Compare that to the peak monthly figures for the Sherman and T-34-85, which reached 750 and over 1,000 examples respectively. Even when the factories were churning out 100 vehicles a month, getting them to the front was also a laborious undertaking. The only real way to get the tanks to the front lines was by train, but the Tiger I was marginally too big to fit on the railcars used by the Germans. Therefore, Henschel developed a travel track which could be fitted to reduce the width, but they still required some of the wheels, side skirts, and the front and rear track guards to be removed, and then all of it reapplied when they reached their destination. Providing, that is, that the train wasn't bombed or strafed by roaming Allied aircraft or blown up by Soviet partisans while en route. Moving from the rail yards to the front was also a careful process. As the 502nd learned at Leningrad, the Tiger I could only operate on hard ground, lest it get stuck in the mud and sink. It was also too heavy for many bridges of the day, which were designed for horse and carts or for early generations of cars, requiring the German army to stop and build a river crossing, where either none were available or the water was too deep to safely wade across. This causing severe delays in an advance, or as the war went on, a retreat. It is important to note though that these problems were by no means unique to the Tiger. As Hitler developed a mania for heavy tanks to combat the vast numbers of Allied tank units, German engineers produced heavier tanks that were equally, if not more complex and difficult to operate. Following on from the Tiger was the Tiger II, or King Tiger, a 68-ton Goliath of a vehicle, which was not only extremely unreliable, but had such poor mobility that many of them were left behind on the battlefield in the speed of a retreat, as they simply couldn't keep up. Regardless, Hitler prioritized production of the Tiger II over the original tank, bringing Tiger I production to an end in late 1944, after just 1,347 tanks were built. 1,500 Tiger IIs were planned, but barely a third of that number would be realized before the end of the war, as Allied bombing devastated Germany's armaments industry. The original Tiger continued to fight increasingly desperate battles with the Allies up to the very last days of the war. Despite being envisioned as a breakthrough tank, it proved itself time and time again to be a superb defensive tank, holding ground against superior enemy numbers for longer than most other tanks on the battlefield could ever hope to achieve. By the end of the war, the Tiger I was still a threat to the vast majority of Allied tanks, and remained a respected design by the Allied nations after the German surrender. Its legacy even inspired the post-war British Army, who, faced with potentially combating thousands of Soviet tanks in the expected Third World War, developed a series of heavy tanks that sacrificed mobility in favor of armor and firepower, and were designed to hold ground in the same way that the Tiger had in the last days of the war. These even sharing some of the flaws of the Tiger as a result. Despite its flaws, the Tiger I has rightfully earned its place as one of the greatest tanks to ever emerge on the battlefield.